was a cold weekend night in November of 2015, the type of night where the wind howled through the trees and the cold seemed to creep into your bones. My 7-year-old son, Sean, was having a sleepover with 4 of his friends. It was supposed to be an exciting night for them, filled with pizza, video games, and endless laughter. My wife wasn't home for the evening. She had gone out for some event, leaving me in charge of keeping an eye on 5 rowdy kids. The thing is, anyone who's been married knows that there's always an unspoken rule. Follow your wife's instructions. She told me to keep an ear on them, but to not hover. I wasn't too worried. After all, it was just 5 7-year-olds in the house. What could possibly go wrong? The night started like any other sleepover. Sean and his friends were in his room, making all kinds of noise. Every now and then, when things got either too loud or too quiet, I'd sneak over to his bedroom door, lean in, and just listen. It sounds a little creepy, I know, but I wasn't spying. I just wanted to make sure they weren't breaking anything, or each other. I remember one time it got really loud. I tiptoed over, and sure enough, they were just playing with Legos and toys, causing a ruckus. Relieved, I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, turning on the TV. I muted it though, just in case I needed to listen again. That's when I heard it. A strange tapping noise coming from Sean's room. At first, I thought it was just one of the boys hitting the wall or the bed, but then it came again, and this time I could hear it clearly. It was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I hesitated, thinking maybe it was just the wind or a branch scraping against the glass. Let them have their fun, I thought. After all, no one was screaming or crying. But then, the tapping stopped, and with it, everything went silent. Now let me tell you, if you've ever been around a group of 7-year-olds, you know that silence is a bad sign. I got up, heart pounding, and made my way back to Sean's door. I pressed my ear to it again. Nothing. No noise. No giggles. Not even a whisper. I opened the door. Inside, Sean and his friends were sitting on the floor, surrounded by toys. Something was off. The window, it was wide open. Cold air was blowing in, making the curtains flutter like something out of a horror movie. "Sean," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "why is the window open?" Sean and the other boys looked at me with wide eyes, clearly not understanding why I was upset. "We were playing," Sean said innocently, "but the pirate told us to keep it open." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What pirate?" "The pirate," one of the other boys, Timmy, exclaimed. "He came to the window and said we were going to find treasure." I glanced around the room, counting the boys. Something was wrong. There were only 4 kids. "Where's Tom?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The boys just blinked at me. "He went with the pirate," Sean said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Find the treasure." For a second, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no pirate. There couldn't be. But Tom wasn't in the room. Without thinking, I rushed to the window and leaned out, scanning the yard. That's when I saw him. A man holding Tom's hand, walking towards the street. I bolted down the hallway and out the front door, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Hey, stop!" The man froze. Slowly, he turned, and our eyes met. I'll never forget his face. He was smiling, a strange, twisted grin that made my skin crawl. He let go of Tom's hand, turned, and ran toward an old, tan-colored Toyota Corolla parked. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off down the street. I grabbed Tom and pulled him back into the house, slamming the door shut behind us. My heart was racing, and I could barely think straight. "What happened?" I demanded. "Who was that man?" "He said he was a pirate," Tom mumbled, rubbing his eyes like he was about to cry. "He said he had treasure." I felt sick. How could this happen in my own home? I had been right there, just a room away, and someone had almost taken my son's friend right under my nose. I made a quick decision. I wasn't going to let this sleepover continue. I called every single parent, telling them what had happened and that they needed to come get their kids immediately. The parents were understandably upset, but they didn't blame me. How could they? Who would ever expect something like this to happen in their own home? As I waited for the parents to arrive, I asked the boys to explain what happened again. "He knocked on the window," John said quietly. "He was dressed like a pirate. He had a big hat, and he talked funny. He said there was treasure outside, and he asked who wanted to come with him." "Tom? You just went with him?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom nodded. He looked fun. Fun. A man who almost kidnapped a child looked fun. When the parents arrived, they were as shocked as I was. They took their kids home, and I sat on the couch, staring at the empty living room. The silence was deafening. Days passed, but the incident haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face. His smile, the way he looked at me like I was the one intruding on his game. I reported the incident to the police, but they never found him. No one had seen the tan Toyota Corolla, and there were no leads. I started to question everything. How had this man known where to find us? How did he know the boys were in that room? Did he watch the house beforehand? The questions kept me up at night, gnawing at my mind like a relentless itch. Weeks turned into months, and though life returned to normal, a lingering fear remained. Sean didn't understand why he wasn't allowed to have sleepovers anymore. I didn't have the heart to tell him the truth, that I was terrified. Not just for him, but for the fact that someone had come into our lives, into our home, and left without a trace. One night, a few months after the incident, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sean was asleep, my wife was upstairs reading, and the wind was howling outside. That's when I heard it again. Tap, 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 from Sean's window. I froze. Couldn't be. Not again. My body felt like it was made of stone as I slowly rose from the couch and crept down the hallway. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. I reached Sean's door and hesitated, my hand trembling on the doorknob. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, lock all the doors, call the police. But I couldn't leave my son in there, not after what had happened before. I pushed the door open, just a crack, enough to peek inside. Sean was asleep, bundled under his blanket, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. At the window was open again, just like that night. The curtains fluttered softly in the breeze, and the cold air bit at my skin. I felt a knot of fear twist in my gut as I stepped into the room, my eyes locked on the open window. Then, without warning, I heard it again, tap, 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 but this time it wasn't the window. It was coming from outside, near the bushes beneath the window, like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I swallowed hard and approached the window. Slowly, cautiously, I leaned out, my eyes scanning the dark yard. At first there was nothing but shadows, long, eerie shadows cast by the trees swaying in the wind. Then I saw it. Figure, standing by the fence at the edge of the yard. It was the same man, the same twisted grin. But this time, he wasn't dressed like a pirate. He was dressed like me. The man wore jeans, a flannel shirt, even a baseball cap like the one I wore. It was like he had studied me, mimicked me, and was now wearing my skin, taunting me. I felt bile rise in my throat as he raised his hand and waved, a slow, mocking gesture. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was caught in my throat. All I could do was stare as the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment I stood frozen in place, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. Who was he? How did he know so much about me? Why had he come back? I slammed the window shut, locked it, and then double-checked every lock in the house. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by Sean's bed, watching him sleep, listening for any sound that didn't belong. In the following weeks, I became obsessed with figuring out who this man was. I installed security cameras around the house, checked the footage every night, but I never saw him again. The police said there wasn't much they could do without more information. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the fear was slowly consuming me. And then one night, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was going through the security footage from the night before, just like I had done every night since the man had reappeared. At first, everything looked normal, just hours of empty footage of the backyard. But then, around 2 a.m., there was a flash of movement near the fence. I rewound the footage, my heart pounding in my chest. It was him, the man from before. He was standing by the fence, just like the last time. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was holding the hand of a child. My stomach dropped as I leaned closer to the screen. The child looked exactly like Sean. Same pajamas, same tousled hair. But Sean had been in his bed all night. I had been there, watching him sleep. I rewound the footage again and again, trying to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the light? Coincidence? Or was it something worse? I didn't know what to believe anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, his grin, and the way he had worn my clothes, stood in my yard, and waved at me like he knew everything about me. I became paranoid, barely leaving the house, keeping Sean close at all times. My wife grew concerned, but I couldn't explain it to her. How could I? How could I tell her that there was a man out there who knew us, who could mimic us, and who had almost taken our son? The final straw came one night, when Sean came to me with a drawing. It was a crude picture, drawn in crayon, of a man standing outside a window, waving. Next to him, a boy held his hand, smiling. The boy looked just like Sean. I don't like him, Sean said, his voice small and scared. He keeps coming back. He says he's you, but I know he's not. I stared at the drawing, my heart racing. Sean, when did you see him? Last night, he whispered. He was outside my window. He wanted me to come with him, but I didn't. I told him you said I wasn't allowed to go outside at night. I felt cold sweat run down my back. This was it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I called the police again, but they didn't believe me. They thought it was a case of mistaken identity, or maybe a neighbor playing a prank. But I knew better. I knew that the man was still out there, watching, waiting. Months later, we moved away. I couldn't live in that house anymore, knowing that he had been there, so close to taking my son. Even now, in a new town, in a new home, I still check the windows every night. I still listen for the sound of tapping on the glass. And every time I hear it, whether it's the wind, a branch, or something else, can't help but wonder if he's back. If he's still out there, waiting for another chance. The thought keeps me awake at night. Because the truth is, no matter how far you run, some things, some nightmares follow you wherever you go. The air was thick with humidity, and the evening sun had begun its slow descent behind the trees. That time of day always brought a sense of quiet restlessness to the town, where nothing much ever happened. For 3 teenagers who were bored and itching for something more, tonight would be different. An adventure they would never forget. I'm telling you, let's just go behind my house. We don't need to go into the woods, Chris said, standing by the open window of his room, lighting a cigarette. His blue hoodie was frayed at the sleeves, and his hands shook slightly as he held the cigarette to his lips. Beside him, Jenna rolled her eyes. She was tall, blonde, and had an attitude as sharp as her looks. Come on, Chris. Behind your house is boring. We've done that 100 times. It's Friday night. Let's do something more fun. Fun, like getting lost in the woods? Eric added with a grin, tossing his backpack over his shoulder. He was the joker of the group, always ready with a sarcastic remark. His shaggy brown hair and careless demeanor made it seem like nothing ever fazed him. I'm down, but I don't want to hear any whining when you both freak out over a raccoon or something. The woods aren't that bad, Jenna said, grabbing Chris's wrist. We'll just smoke, hang out for a bit, and head back. No big deal. Chris sighed. Fine, but we're not staying long, and no exploring random creepy path. Got it? Yeah. Jenna waved him off. Let's go. The trio set off from Chris's house, which bordered a quiet neighborhood that crept dangerously close to the woods. The trees loomed over the houses like silent watchers, their branches gnarled and twisted in ways that seemed unnatural. The entrance to the woods was just a short walk away, a gap in the tree line that beckoned them forward. The moment they crossed into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. It was cooler in there, the air still and thick with the scent of damp earth. Chris felt a twinge of regret as they walked deeper, but he didn't say anything. The others seemed at ease, laughing and joking about how dumb their school was or how their parents didn't understand anything. For a while, it was fun. They smoked, laughed, and told stories, their voices bouncing off the trees. But as the sun sank lower and the sky dimmed to a dusky gray, something changed. The woods grew quieter, too quiet. I think we should head back, Chris said, his voice low. He flicked the ash from his cigarette and looked around. It's getting late, Jenna smirked. Scared already? No, just not dumb enough to get lost in here after dark. Eric snickered, but Chris noticed that even he was glancing around a bit more now. He's right, Eric said, surprising them both. These woods get weird at night." They started back toward the way they came, but the sense of unease hung in the air like a fog. Chris kept his eyes trained on the ground, trying to follow the path they had taken, but the woods seemed different now. The trees were closer together, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It wasn't long before they saw it. Old blue Chevy truck parked near the entrance to the woods. "That's weird," Chris muttered, pulse quickening. The truck hadn't been there when they entered. It was an old, rusted thing, the kind you'd expect to see abandoned in a junkyard, not parked ominously near a darkened path. Jenna stopped laughing. "Who do you think it belongs to?" Eric shrugged, though he looked uneasy. "Maybe some redneck. Let's just keep walking." But as they moved closer, the truck's engine roared to life, its headlights blaring like two blazing eyes fixed on them. Without thinking, Chris grabbed Jenna's arm, yanking her backward as the truck lurched forward. "Run!" Chris yelled, his heart slamming in his chest. They bolted down the path, branches whipping their faces as they sprinted deeper into the woods. The truck followed, its engine revving angrily, headlights cutting through the darkness. "This isn't happening. This isn't happening," Jenna whispered, half to herself, as they scrambled over fallen logs and roots. Eric was panting hard beside them, his face pale. "Who the hell is driving that thing?" Chris didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to figure out where they could go. They couldn't outrun a truck, not in these woods. But if they could just get to the hill, the one that sloped down sharply, they might be able to lose it. "There! The hill!" Chris shouted, pointing. The three of them slid down the steep incline, gravel and dirt flying beneath their feet as they crashed to the bottom. The truck roared above them, its headlights scanning the area, but it couldn't follow them down the hill. For a moment, they were safe. Catching his breath, Chris crouched low behind a thick tree trunk, peering through the branches. The truck had stopped at the top of the hill, its engine idling. "What now?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "We wait," Chris replied. "Just stay quiet." Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the truck's engine cut off, and the headlights blinked out. Silence fell over the woods once more, and Chris felt a flicker of hope. Maybe whoever was driving had given up. Then they heard it. The slow, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. Someone was coming down the hill. Chris's heart pounded in his ears as he pressed himself against the tree, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps were slow, methodical, like whoever was coming knew exactly where they were. "Stay still," Chris whispered, his hand clutching Jenna's. Footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right above them. Chris could hear the sound of heavy breathing, could almost feel the person's presence through the dark. And then, just as suddenly, footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Chris didn't move. Neither did Jenna or Eric. They sat frozen, waiting, praying that whoever it was would turn around and leave. But instead, a low, raspy voice cut through the darkness like a knife. "I know you're down there." The voice said. Chris felt a chill run down his spine. It was the voice of an older man, gravelly and cold. "You think you can hide from me?" The voice continued, haunting them. "I've been watching you the whole time." Jenna whimpered softly, and Chris squeezed her hand tighter, trying to keep her calm. The man's voice was getting closer, footsteps resuming their slow, menacing approach. "Come on out," the man said. "I just want to talk." Chris's mind raced. Couldn't stay there. If they waited any longer, the man would find them. But if they ran, where would they go? Before he could decide, Eric suddenly bolted from behind the tree, sprinting into the woods. "Eric, no!" Chris hissed, but it was too late. The man let out a sickening laugh and took off after him. Jenna sobbed quietly as the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. "What do we do, Chris? What do we do?" Chris swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Go back to the house. Now, we'll figure out what happened to Eric later. We can't help him if pot." Jenna nodded, face pale. They didn't waste any more time. Chris and Jenna didn't speak as they ran through the dense forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves and underbrush. Every muscle in Chris's body was tense, his heart pounding in his ears as they navigated through the maze of trees. Every shadow felt like it was closing in on them, every sound in the woods amplified by their heightened fear. There was no turning back now. They had to get out. Chris glanced back over his shoulder. The woods stretched endlessly behind them, thick and oppressive. There was no sign of the man, but Eric's sudden disappearance gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the sound of the man's voice, a sick amusement in his words, like he was enjoying their fear. "We have to get out of here," Jenna panted, stumbling over a fallen branch. She caught herself and kept running, tears streaming down her face. "Chris, I'm scared." "I know," Chris said, though fear was tearing at him too. He kept his voice steady for her sake. "Just a little further. The woods end soon." But even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure where they were anymore. The woods, which had seemed so familiar just a few hours ago, now felt like an endless labyrinth. His phone had no signal, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. Darkness settled in fast. They kept running, breathless, until the sight of something stopped them dead in their track. Up ahead, barely visible in the dim light, was a small cabin. It stood alone, rotting and forgotten, just a few yards off the path. The windows were cracked, the door barely hanging on its rusted hinges. The place reeked of abandonment, but at the same time, felt like someone, or something, was watching them from the inside. "No," Jenna gasped, shaking her head as if she already knew what Chris was thinking. "No way, we're not going in there." Chris hesitated. He knew it was a bad idea, but if the man was still out there, if he was hunting them, they needed somewhere to hide, at least for a little while. The cabin was the only option. "We don't have a choice," Chris said, his voice hoarse. "We can hide in there, just for a bit, until we know it's safe." Jenna didn't argue further. Her legs were trembling, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. Without another word, they moved toward the cabin. Chris pushed the door open, the old wood creaking loudly in protest. The smell of mildew and rot hit them immediately, and Chris gagged, pulling his hoodie up over his nose. The inside was worse than the outside, dark, damp, and filled with broken furniture and old debris. "Close the door," Jenna whispered, glancing nervously behind them. "Please." Chris shut the door softly, wincing at the sound. The cabin was silent, save for the distant rustle of leaves outside. They both stood still, trying to listen for any sign of the man, but all they could hear was the eerie quiet of the forest at night. "There's no way that guy's still following us, right?" Jenna whispered. Her voice shook. There was a glimmer of hope in it. Maybe we lost him. Chris didn't want to give her false hope, but he nodded anyway. "Yeah, maybe." They sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, trying to catch their breath. For a few moments, the only sound was the rhythmic rise and fall of their heavy breathing. But something about the cabin felt off. There was an unsettling presence to it. The walls themselves were holding some dark secret. Chris's gaze wandered around the small, cluttered space. There were old beer cans and dirty clothes scattered on the floor, signs that someone had lived here recently. He noticed a small door at the back of the cabin, partially hidden by a tattered curtain. Something about it made his skin crawl. "We should just wait until morning," Jenna murmured, wrapping her arms around herself. "We'll leave as soon as the sun comes up." Chris was about to agree when they heard it, a noise outside. Faint at first, like a distant rustle of leaves, but then unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and growing closer. Chris's stomach twisted into knots. Jenna's eyes widened in terror as she grabbed Chris's arm. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Chris motioned for her to stay quiet. He slowly stood up, creeping toward the nearest window to get a glimpse of what was outside. The cabin had no electricity, and the darkness was nearly impenetrable. The faint outline of a figure moved just outside the cabin. It was him, the man from the truck. Chris ducked back down, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might give them away. Crawled back toward Jenna, who was frozen with fear. "He's outside," Chris mouthed, barely making a sound. Jenna's face paled. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob. Chris racked his brain, trying to come up with a plan, but there was no way out. The man was blocking the door, and the windows were too small to crawl through without making noise. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the door. Chris and Jenna both jumped, eyes wide with terror. The man was trying to get in. Thud, thud. Each knock was deliberate, as if the man was toying with them, letting them know he could break down the door whenever he wanted. "We have to hide," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to find somewhere to hide." Chris glanced around the small cabin, but there was nowhere, except for the small door at the back, the one that had made his skin crawl earlier. He didn't have a choice. "Come on," he whispered, grabbing Jenna's hand and pulling her toward the back of the cabin. "Quick." They moved as quietly as they could, slipping behind the curtain and pushing open the small door. It led to a narrow staircase, descending into what looked like a cellar. Chris hesitated for a moment, the musty, damp air hitting him like a wave. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the darkness. The cellar was small and cramped, with low ceilings and dirt floors. Old tools and jars lined the shelves, coated in dust. They crouched in the corner, holding their breaths, hoping the man wouldn't find the hidden door. Above them, the thuds continued, each one more violent than the last. Crash! The door to the cabin burst open, and heavy footsteps echoed through the space above them. Chris squeezed Jenna's hand, his mind racing. The man was inside now, searching for them. Every creak of the floorboards above sent waves of panic through Chris's body. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped, a moment of deafening silence. Chris strained to listen, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. He didn't dare to breathe. And then, without warning, the cellar door above them swung open. The man stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the faint light. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. "I told you I'd find you," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. Jenna let out a strangled sob as Chris pulled her closer. There was no way out now. Chris and Jenna huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with terror as the man descended the stairs one slow, deliberate step at a time. The dim light from above cast eerie shadows on his face, highlighting his hollow eyes and malevolent gaze. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone was enough to drive them into despair. The man paused halfway down the stairs, his eyes fixed intently on them. Chris felt those eyes, cold, probing, examining them as if he already knew what they had done, or worse, what they had seen. "You weren't supposed to be here." The man's voice was rough, his words deliberate and heavy with menace. "Not tonight, not in this place." Jenna trembled, her voice breaking in fear. "We didn't see anything. We got lost. Please just let us go." The man's lips curled into a thin, chilling smile. "Didn't see anything?" He tilted his head, as if pondering the absurdity of their claim. "It's hard to believe, but perhaps you did see something you weren't supposed to. Something you were never meant to witness." Chris frowned, struggling to grasp the full meaning behind his words. "We don't understand. We didn't see anything. We just went into the woods. We just want to leave." The man's gaze was unfathomable as he assessed their sincerity. "There are secrets in those woods," he said slowly, his tone dripping with dark implication. "Secrets that sometimes one must protect at all costs." Chris and Jenna held their breath. They had made a terrible mistake, that much was clear. But now there was no way back. The man took a step back up the stairs, his demeanor shifting as if he had made a final, dreadful decision. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with ominous finality. "You won't have to worry about what you've seen, because you'll never be able to leave." Cast one last look at them, his eyes still cold and unfeeling. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he began to close the hatch. The sound of the hinge creaking shut was terrifyingly slow, each moment dragging out their dread. Chris scrambled to the hatch, desperately trying to pry it open, but it was too late. Jenna screamed in horror. The lock clicked into place, a heavy and final sound. But that wasn't all. Chris heard the scraping noise of metal against metal, as if the man was adding something heavy on top of the hatch. They were trapped, sealed in the darkness below, with no way to escape. Chris pounded on the hatch, his fists striking futilely against the impenetrable barrier. "Open the door, please. We didn't see anything. Open the door." No response came, only the sound of the man's retreating footsteps, growing fainter and fainter, until they were completely gone. Jenna slumped to the floor, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice trembling with despair. Chris didn't answer. In the suffocating darkness, all hope seemed to evaporate. They were trapped, buried alive in this cellar, with no one knowing they were here. No one would come to save them. The silence in the cellar was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their labored breathing. They knew they might never escape this place, and the man, he was gone, but his shadow would forever linger in this endless night. The wind howled faintly through the cracks above, bearing with it the man's final, chilling message. Don't worry. You won't have to worry about what you've seen, ever again. The story ends here, but the fate of Chris and Jenna remains unresolved, haunting them in the dark, inescapable void. It was a chilly September night in rural Virginia, the kind of night where the cold seeps into your bones and makes you shiver, even if you're wrapped in layers. Zachary Lawson, a 27-year-old who had recently moved into a small, creaky house on the outskirts of town, was making his way home from a local bar. The place was the only hangout spot in their sleepy town, a place that roared with college students and locals every weekend. Zach had spent the night there with a group of friends, drinking and laughing, trying to escape the monotony of his quiet life. As the clock neared 2 a.m., he said his goodbyes and stumbled out into the chilly night, eager to get back to his own bed. The walk home was a short one, just 3 blocks from the bar to his small old house. Zach fumbled with his keys, trying to find the right one as he approached his front stoop. But something felt off. The front door was ajar. He froze, his inebriated brain trying to make sense of the situation. He knew he had locked the door before he left. The darkness inside the house was almost palpable. Zach pushed the door open slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. He stepped inside and immediately noticed a note on the kitchen counter. It was written in his mother's familiar handwriting, though the words were shaky, like she was holding the pen with a trembling hand. Zach, you left this at our house. Came to clean a bit and bring you some cake. Love, Mom. Zach sighed. It was the same old story. His mother, Betty, in her early 60s and growing increasingly worrisome with age, had a habit of showing up unannounced. She had even managed to get a spare key from Zach when he was feeling particularly soft-hearted. He didn't mind her visits, but this late at night, it was a bit much. He assumed Betty had come over, made her usual rounds of cleaning, and then went upstairs to sleep in the guest room, as she often did. Zach didn't see her anywhere downstairs, so he headed upstairs to check on her. The stairs creaked under his weight, the sound of each step amplified by the silence of the house. The guest bedroom was empty. Zach's heart began to race. If Betty was having one of her episodes due to her worsening memory, she might be wandering around. Checked the bathrooms, but she wasn't there either. Growing increasingly anxious, Zach grabbed his phone and dialed his father, Robert. The phone rang 4 times before his father answered, his voice heavy with sleep. Zach, what's wrong? I heard footsteps upstairs, Dad. I think Mom might be having an episode. She's not in the guest room or any of the bathrooms. I'm really worried. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Zach could almost hear the gears turning in his father's head. That's not possible, Robert finally said, his voice tinged with confusion. She's right here with me. She's been in bed for hours. Zach's blood ran cold. Turned his head toward the darkened staircase. A shadow, a vague outline of a head, was peering around the corner at the top of the stairs. His heart pounded in his chest. Panic surged through him, and he screamed into the phone. I see something upstairs. I'm getting out of here. Without waiting for a response, Zach bolted down the stairs, threw open the front door, and ran out into the street. He could hear the distant wail of sirens as he sprinted toward his parents' house. Breath came in ragged gasps as he explained the situation to his father over the phone. When he arrived at his parents' home, porch light cast a warm glow over the front yard. Betty was waiting at the door, her face etched with concern. Zach was barely able to catch his breath as he explained what had happened. Robert, having heard the commotion, was already on the phone with the police. The officers arrived quickly. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the driveway, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the ground. Zach and his father waited outside as the officers went into Zach's house to investigate. Zach paced nervously, cold night air stinging his skin. Every rustle of the leaves, every distant sound, seemed amplified. After what felt like an eternity, the officers emerged. "There's no sign of forced entry or anything suspicious," one officer said. "The house is clear. We checked the attic, crawl space, and every room. It looks like someone might have left the door unlocked." Zach's heart sank. The officer's words made sense. It was possible that Betty had accidentally left the door open after cleaning, but Zach couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister had happened. The officer's words did little to ease the gnawing dread in his gut. That night, Zach stayed at his parents' house. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in his own home, not after what he had seen or thought he had seen. The shadow at the top of the stairs haunted him. He lay awake in the guest room, every creak of the house making him jump. In the days that followed, Zach's unease didn't fade. He found himself constantly checking the locks on his doors and windows, peering into dark corners as if expecting to see that shadow again. His father decided to stop Betty from coming over alone, a decision that Zach understood, hated to see. Betty's condition was worsening, and the safety of her actions was becoming a growing concern. Zach's anxiety remained even after his parents knew precautions. Every time he walked into his house, he half expected to find something or someone lurking in the dark. The memory of the shadow and the chilling realization that someone had been in his house gnawed at him, leaving him restless and jumpy. One night, a few weeks later, Zach was alone in his house, trying to read a book to distract himself from his fears. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. A sudden noise, like a faint knock, startled him. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. It came again, a soft tapping, as if someone was knocking on the door or the walls. He got up, trembling, and went to check the front door. It was locked. Tapping continued, growing louder, and it seemed to come from the upstairs. Zach's mind raced. Had someone returned? Was it the same shadowy figure from that night? He grabbed a flashlight and slowly made his way up the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. As he reached the top, the tapping ceased. He checked every room, every closet, but found nothing. The house seemed empty, but the eerie feeling remained. In the days following, Zach couldn't shake the sense of being watched. He started avoiding the house as much as possible, spending more time at his parents' place or with friends. He found solace in the company of others, far away from the haunting emptiness of his own home. One evening, as Zach was visiting his parents, Robert approached him with a serious expression. "Zach, I need to show you something," he said, leading Zach to the basement. Zach's anxiety flared up as he followed his father down the stairs. The basement was dimly lit, filled with old furniture and boxes. Robert moved to a corner and pulled out a dusty box. He opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs and documents. Among them was a faded, black and white picture of a house that looked strikingly similar to Zach's. "This was the house before we bought it," Robert said. "I found these while going through some old records. I don't know why, but I felt like you should see them." Zach stared at the photographs, his heart pounding. The house in the picture had the same layout, the same creaky stairs, and the same eerie feeling that had been haunting him. But there was something else in the photograph, an indistinct figure standing in the doorway, almost hidden in the shadows. The realization hit Zach like a cold wave. The house had a history, and whatever was lurking in its dark corners had been there long before he moved in. The feeling of dread that had been growing inside him was not just his imagination. It was connected to something far more sinister. Zach's paranoia only deepened as he tried to make sense of the new revelation. The shadow, the tapping, the sense of being watched, it all seemed to fit into a pattern he couldn't ignore. He began to question the safety of his own home, unsure if he would ever truly feel at ease there again. In the end, Zach couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was haunting his house had become a part of him. He continued to live in his old house, but he never felt completely alone. The darkness that lurked in the corners and the shadows that seemed to move on their own were constant reminders of the mystery that had taken root in his life. And though he tried to rationalize it, deep down, he knew that the house would always hold its secrets. Secrets that would forever keep him on edge, even in the comfort of his own home.